Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining. This is Christina Bain from Babson College's Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, and I want to welcome you all to our webinar today. This is the 5th webinar in our series, The Human Trafficking Organized Crime Nexus, Intersections, Vulnerabilities, and Analysis for the Private Sector. And today our featured topic is human trafficking in the illicit cigarette trade, global consequences. And we've got a dynamic panel of presenters to talk to you today about an issue that's not as much talked about, I think, in the illicit trade arena. And we're really excited to have put together a panel and to be able to cover this topic as part of our series. As many of you know, that we've been doing this webinar series since January, and we've been looking at different aspects of human trafficking and illicit trade and how different forms of illicit trade really intersect with human trafficking and how that leaves the private sector vulnerable. So this is our next to last webinar. We're going to have a final webinar in June that will tell you a bit more later in the program. So thank you to all of you who've actually been sticking with us for all of the webinars. I know we have some of you who've been with us since the beginning, and we're so excited to have you on our call today. Just some technical information in order to get you started. We are recording this webinar today, so you'll be able to access an exact snapshot of all of the different PowerPoints and discussion points from the webinar today, including the question and answer section. So what we're going to do for the first hour is we're going to hear from all of our presenters. We have 4 presenters, and then we're going to take your questions during the second hour of our conversation today. So I do encourage you to use the text chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. And when you go to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a Send To button on the bottom. And you can send a question to the host, you can send it to presenters, or you can send it to all the participants. So if you have any challenges finding that, we're here to help. So let us know, and we will make sure that you're able to access your chat box. Additionally, I just ask if you are not speaking, if you can just mute your microphone. You'll find that to the right of your name. On the registration list a little bit above the chat box. You do also have the option for audio to change from listening via the computer or listening via the phone. So if at any chance you have a challenge with hearing, you can click on that gray audio button right above the chat box, right below the check mark and the X, and you are able to switch on and off between the phone and the computer. And again, let us know if you have any challenges finding that or with any audio situation. So again, I want to welcome you, and I'm just going to just make a few announcements before I introduce our upcoming speakers. And I first want to thank, in addition to my co-hosts, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the International Organization for Migration, which make up the RESPECT initiative, the Responsible and Ethical Private Sector Coalition Against Trafficking, which you're going to hear more about from my colleague Livia in a few minutes. But I want to also thank the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, which is part of the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, CINA, Center of Excellence, the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States. It's a collaboration that they've just recently received, and it's a really exciting and dynamic center. And today we're really lucky to feature my dear friend and mentor and colleague, Dr. Louise Shelley, who's actually going to be moderating the session. And she is the founder of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center and director. So you're going to be hearing more from her in a little bit. And that's the website for track.gmu.edu. They're located at George Mason University in Virginia here in the United States. So now what I would like to do is I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Livia Wagner. And before I do that, I just want to go over our disclaimer policy. You'll see that here that we're putting up on all the webinars. And now I am going to introduce Livia, who is going to tell us about the RESPECT initiative. Livia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be presenting you here at the webinar a little bit about the Respect Initiative, and I'm sending you greetings from Vienna from the UN Crime Commission, where we were able to present Respect for the UN member states. And now a few words to the Respect Initiative, which was founded by us, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Babson College, and the UN Migration Agency, IOM. Can everybody see that I'm forwarding the slides?
Yep.
Okay. So as you can see, here are the organizations that have founded Respect. It was officially launched now in January 2018. As we felt that there is a lot of experience out there, a lot of information has been developed already, and we felt that it was very necessary to take stock and to bring together all this information out there to one place, which is the Respect platform. And I encourage you to go and visit respect.international. And what Respect is offering is mainly an online resource center, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. But the Respect platform is also a peer exchange platform. That means to share the knowledge, the good practices, also mainly through our resource center. The webinars, which you are participating now, and also we are developing some industry-specific case studies, but we also want to facilitate the interaction among leading business actors, but also other members from other stakeholder groups. And here you can see a snapshot of the resource center, and I really encourage you to have a look at that, because there you can find all the wealth of information that has been developed by not only NGOs, but private sector companies themselves and also international organizations. And it's grouped by different topics. And you can just have a dive into the hundreds of publications that we have gathered already. And we are also very happy to receive more and more publications from your side. The Respect webinar series, we have started this in 2015, and now it's already the 4th webinar series that we are concluding. And by that, we will have conducted 24 webinars, inviting 96 speakers from different areas like private sector, law enforcement, civil society, governmental institutions, media, academia, and also independent experts. Each webinar has about 150 and 200 registrants from all around the world. And yeah, we're trying to also provide a balance between the regions, but also the different topics. The current webinar series, as you may have seen, has the overarching topic of transnational organized crime and how the private sector is vulnerable to the penetration of organized crime. And our next webinar, and I'm going to conclude with that, is going to take place in June, and is going to look at cybercrime and the intersections with online sexual exploitation. So I'm very happy that you are attending our webinar, and giving back to Christina.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and it's just been a joy having you alongside this journey with Respect, and it's really exciting to see how much has come about from the webinar series that we started. So thank you so much. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Louise Shelley, who's going to be moderating our session today. And you heard a bit about her earlier in the program in the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center. And she has so many accomplishments, it's very hard to focus on even just a few things, because she's done so much. And so you'll see some highlights here. And I especially want to give a shout out about her 2 books, Dirty Entanglements and Human Trafficking. Human Trafficking was actually the first book that I ever read pretty much on human trafficking from a global perspective and looking at transnational organized crime issues. It's really an important part of so many courses around the world that focus on human trafficking. It's just a major body of work, and I think it was really the first in terms of a lot of comprehensive information on the relationship between transnational organized crime and human trafficking and all the different intersections. And I really just encourage all of you to check out both of her work, Dirty Entanglements and Human Trafficking. And she's going to be having a new book coming out shortly, also on illicit trade issues. So additionally, I just want to also tell you just a bit more about Dr. Shelley. She received her undergraduate degree cum laude from Cornell University in Penology and Russian Research. She also holds an MA in Criminology from the University of Pennsylvania, and she also holds a PhD in Sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. She is the recipient of the Guggenheim, NEH, IREX, Kennan Institute, and Fulbright Fellowships, and received a MacArthur grant to establish the Russian Organized Crime Study Centers, and recently completed a MacArthur grant studying non-state actors and nuclear proliferation. In 1992, she received the Scholar Teacher Prize of American University, the top academic award of the university. She's run different programs focused on the problems of organized crime and corruption in Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia. And she has also spoken at various international fora and at many universities, both in the United States and abroad, on transnational organized crime issues, terrorism, and human trafficking, illicit trade, and corruption. We also started together a task force looking at human trafficking with the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council Network. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome her here today to moderate our conversation. And the floor is yours, Dr. Shelley.
Thank you. Thank you for such a nice introduction. And I'm very interested in this issue of illicit cigarette trade. In fact, my new book called Dark Commerce, which is coming out this fall, which was done with an Andrew Carnegie fellow, one of the reviewers said that the subject of illicit cigarette trade is like a fugue throughout the book. And that's because it appears in so many different ways, as we're going to be hearing in the presentations. And there are different types of illicit cigarette trade. We have trade of diverted cigarettes, of smuggled counterfeit cigarettes, and of something called illicit whites, which are cigarettes produced to be smuggled. And this is not a small-scale activity. In fact, one of the few times in my life that I've actually been threatened in my research was in writing and speaking in Georgia about the illicit white trade coming out of Iraq. So this is a problem that is not just focused on cigarettes. It intersects with drugs, with people, with wildlife, and many other types of illicit activity. And as we're going to see, it is not just a revenue generator for transnational crime groups. It provides venture capital for other types of illicit trade. For example, in my coming book, I describe how Vietnamese groups that are active in Germany and the Czech Republic have used the capital they've generated from the illicit cigarette trade to go into the more lucrative trade in rhino horn. So this is a revenue generator. And it's also something, an illicit trade, that is deeply tied to problems of corruption. So that once people have bribed border officials to move cigarettes, they can move drugs, they can move WMD, they can move other things. And also, I don't think anybody is talking about this in their presentations today, but much of illicit financial flows in the world today is not going through wire transfers or necessarily cash. It is going through something called trade-based money laundering. And cigarettes can be used as a commodity to move money for illicit actors. Also, as we're going to talk about in other presentations today, it is a form of funding for terrorism. We also have, and we'll be talking more today, about the problems of the ant trade. And what are ants, or what human beings become couriers, and they're moving cigarettes, they're moving drugs to pay for their transport. And we're seeing that in the cigarette trade. So we're seeing sometimes individuals moving cigarettes in small quantities, and then we also see cigarettes being moved along with smuggled people, and we're going to see that in some of the cases that are being discussed by our speakers with so much expertise today. And also, as I write about in Dark Commerce, one form of illicit trade often goes with another form of illicit trade. So when you have illicit cigarette production, just like you have marijuana production, both of them are often being done with trafficked laborers, because you cannot get individuals to readily agree to work in an illicit factory. So these human exploitation goes along with illicit production. There's one other point that I think is very interesting that is not in our presentations, because it's not about illicit trade in the illicit economy, but the fact that the cigarette industry, the legitimate cigarette industry, has tried to clean up its supply chains. And if you go to the website of Verite, which Christina has had represented on other fora, which is a wonderful organization that works with corporations on making sure that they do not have exploited laborers in their supply chain, you will find some information on what PMI has done to prevent labor exploitation among the laborers that produce tobacco around the world. And this is a real problem, because many products that are based on cheap commodities are ones in which trafficked laborers are involved. And so there's a problem of illicit sources for even licit commodities. And this is an issue that we're not talking about much today, but I think is something we also need to be thinking about and looking at some of the case studies of what have been done to clean up this sector, which is important in making sure that the licit sector stays clean and thinks about the workers that are producing the raw commodities. So that is sort of the overview that I wanted to give and show how many different areas we are touching in looking at the illicit cigarette trade. And I'm very happy that we have in the slides today some really current and fascinating cases that bring the convergence of the illicit cigarette trade and human smuggling and trafficking into the open in ways that are not readily available to the casual observer. You have to be delving pretty deeply to find these cases. So let's start off. Our first speaker today is Cathy Heinlein, who is a Senior Research Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute's National Security and Resilience Studies Group, where she leads the Institute's research program on serious and organized crime. Cathy's research focuses on illicit trade and environmental crime, particularly in Europe, East and Southern Africa. She is also the chair of RUSI's Strategic Hub for Organized Crime Research, established in partnership with the Home Office, the National Crime Agency, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and Research Councils of the UK. Cathy has broad experience. She has undertaken research on illicit trade and trafficking of illegal commodities for the European Commission, the British government, the OECD, otherwise known as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and she's conducted field work in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Madagascar, the Seychelles, Gabon, and Sierra Leone. She leads RUSI's research on illicit tobacco, alcohol, and pharmaceuticals, covering the ONTAP series, among other projects. She also has an academic hat, being a research associate in King's College London's major Marjan Center for the Study of War and the Non-Human Sphere. She holds an MSc in Distinction in African Politics from SOAS, University of London, with a focus on crime, conflict, and grievance. Before RUSI, Cathy spent 5 years in Italy working with European journals on EU-Africa relations with a focus on illegal migration. So I turn the floor over to Cathy now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Louise, for that introduction. Just to, for those of you who don't know about RUSI, we are an independent British think tank focusing on defense and security issues, and we're actually the oldest institute of our kind in the world. At RUSI, we've traditionally had something of a military focus, but as the nature of the global security threats have changed, our focus has also shifted, and that shift has increasingly been towards issues such as transnational organized crime and illicit trade. So today I've been asked to give quite a broad overview of some of our research at RUSI on the illicit cigarette trade, and specifically in terms of the organized crime dynamics that are driving it. I myself won't be discussing the link to human trafficking specifically. This is something that's been assigned to the next two speakers. But the aim in this presentation really is to set the scene in terms of some of the recent trends we've been seeing in the market for illicit cigarettes, particularly in Europe, and how those trends have been evolving over time. And I also want to just talk very briefly about one of the key enablers of the illicit cigarette trade that we've identified, and which I think is particularly important as we look at the link to human trafficking, and that is the issue of consumer demand and social acceptability. So the findings that I'm going to just discuss briefly, they draw from a number of years of research into the illicit trade that we've conducted at RUSI, and this research has covered not only tobacco but also alcohol and pharmaceuticals. You can see here on the screen a few of the recent publications that we've produced. A lot of our work has revolved around the ONTAP series. On the slide you can see 3 of our ONTAP reports, the first 2 on the UK and Romania. The third is an EU-level overview, and we've also conducted research into alcohol, illicit tobacco, alcohol and pharmaceuticals in Spain, Greece, Italy and Poland. The 4th report you can see here is the 2016 iteration of Project Sun, with which I'm sure many of you are very familiar as one of the key means of calculating the scale of the illicit cigarette market across Europe, and that's a project on which RUSI works with KPMG. So I've only got 10 minutes, so I can only make a few points, but I think to start, it's particularly important to consider just why the illicit cigarette trade is so attractive to organized crime groups. And I think this really relates to the fact that the illicit cigarette trade is a form of organized crime that's received significantly less attention than other crime types, despite the fact that it provides a substantial source of income for organized crime groups. In 2016, over 48 billion illicit cigarettes were consumed in Europe, according to Project Sun, depriving governments of 10.2 billion euros in tax and providing extensive profits to organized crime. Despite this, the largely invisible nature of this crime means that governments have historically underestimated and under-prioritized this threat. Often the responses at a national level can be very fragmented and are often split between different agencies. As a result, we found that there's actually a very limited intelligence picture on some of the routes, groups and methods that are involved in the illicit cigarette trade. At the same time, the penalties associated with this trade are often very much lower than those associated with other forms of trafficking. And the result is really a very low-risk, high-reward crime type that is very attractive to organized crime. So at RUSI, we wanted to look into this a bit more closely and review what existing knowledge there is and see how we could build on this picture in terms of how this trade is actually working and adaptations in the groups involved and the methods they're using over time. So this slide just shows the way we've gone about some of this work. It shows the locations in which we've conducted research, and we've used really a multi-method approach in all of these countries, working closely with law enforcement agencies to gain operational experience of the threat and the methods used to tackle it, and combining this with best research, primary interviews, and workshops with wider stakeholders to test those findings. So I just want to go over a couple of the main findings that we've got time for, just in terms of the groups and the methods involved, before moving into this social acceptability issue as a key enabler. So in terms of groups first, we found that many of the groups involved are organised crime groups, pre-existing organised crime groups, which have actually diversified from other forms of crime to exploit this low-risk activity. And often this is not a complete shift. So some groups remain active in other crime types while also getting involved in the illicit cigarette trade and shifting between different types of illicit commodities over time, but often using the same networks for all of them, the same networks of associates, the same routes, the same trafficking methods, and adopting this very flexible approach. So as a result, there have been numerous cases where law enforcement have detected overlaps with other organised crime activity. In Spain, as just one example, a 2014 operation saw more than 5 million illicit cigarettes seized from a network that was also involved in distributing counterfeit clothing and drug trafficking. There are also overlaps often with trafficking in other forms of other commodities, such as fuel, alcohol, pharmaceuticals. Just one example, a case study we went over in our research. In Poland, there was a recent discovery of an illicit cigarette factory, which had actually been at the site of a former illicit alcohol factory. Both of these factories had been run by the same group and had been distributing their illicit products via the same networks. Our findings have also shown that the groups involved operate as very flexible transient networks, cooperating on an ad hoc basis for mutual benefit. This is part of a broader shift identified across Europe from more hierarchical, structured organised crime groups towards more transient, mobile alignments of actors. Memberships of these groups is often shifting and unclear, and at the same time, these groups are highly resourceful and able to very quickly identify new business opportunities. This agility poses significant challenges to law enforcement, whose much less flexible structures are less suited to the dynamic nature of this threat. So just moving on to look at some of the methods involved, many findings on this front, but I think one of the most interesting is the shift that we've seen from trafficking in bulk towards a more of a little and often approach alongside that. So this little and often approach allows organised crime groups to minimise losses in the event of detection and to operate under the radar of law enforcement so that they can really just evade inspection and enforcement in the first place. So this low volume, high frequency smuggling is done in a number of ways. It can involve maritime routes, using smaller vessels to land at smaller ports and often isolated beaches. It can occur across land borders via pedestrian and smuggling, as Louise mentioned, and through the use of modified vehicles using cover loads. More and more, it can often involve a postal system, which is perfectly suited really to this little and often smuggling. Organised crime groups are increasingly using postal and fast parcel services to really flood the system with numerous small packages of illicit cigarettes, and this is a very effective approach. Law enforcement operates on the basis of thresholds and can't hope to stop all of the number of these illicit consignments that are coming through the system. So I just want to move on quickly to enablers. So this exploitation of postal services is just one in a number of enabling factors that we've identified that really favour this form of illicit trade and allow it to be such a profitable activity. This slide just shows a number of the enablers that we've identified: use of the internet, exploitation of free trade zones, the role of corruption, again, at borders and inland. But I just want to skip through to one particular enabler that we've identified, and I think that's particularly relevant to the discussion today, and that is the issue of persistent consumer demand that we've seen for illicit cigarettes across Europe. So throughout our research, we've identified again and again this social acceptability as a critical facilitator. And often we found that that's been driven by a perception, really, that this is a trade that is a victimless trade. It's a victimless crime. And many consumers, we found, have been very quick to excuse involvement in the trade by those who are actually distributing illicit cigarettes, often blaming poor economic conditions or, loss of disposable income. Many are completely unaware of the links to organized crime. In 2013, for example, there was a Eurobarometer survey that showed that across Europe, only 35% of those surveys perceived the generation of revenue for organized crime as one of the main problems of the illicit cigarette trade. In Spain, just to give a national level example, a 2013 survey by a Spanish think tank found that 41% of Spaniards didn't have a negative opinion of tobacco smuggling, which is obviously a fairly high percentage. So I think this is really important in terms of what the next speakers are going to go on to discuss. I think in particular this social acceptability shows the really limited awareness that exists of the link between illicit cigarettes and other forms of trafficking. One of our main recommendations at RUSI for a long time has focused on the need to alter this public perception through messaging campaigns and other means. And I think this exploration of the link to human trafficking today could be a really crucial element in that work. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm really looking forward to the next two presentations and look forward to discussing at the end how we can really raise awareness of some of these dynamics. Thanks.
Thank you, Cathy. Please remember to send in your questions to the text chat box, because we'll be having questions following up after the audience, after we finish the three presentations. We are now going on to Phil Charlton, who is the Anti-Illicit Trade Operations Manager for Western Europe for Japan Tobacco International. Like many in the corporate world, Phil has a background in law enforcement. He first joined the Cheshire Constabulary in 1981. Cheshire is a county of approximately 1 million residents and borders Liverpool and Manchester in the northwest of England. After serving 2 years in uniform, Phil transferred to the Criminal Investigation Division and worked at various ranks in the following departments: General Crime Investigation, Drug Squad, Serious Crime Squad. In 1997, Phil went on a secondment as Detective Inspector to the Regional and then National Crime Squads, responsible for managing cross-border national and international organized crime. He returned to Cheshire Police on promotion and worked as Detective Chief Inspector and then as Detective Superintendent Crime Operations, covering all the specifics all the specialist crime units, including murder investigation, kidnap and blackmail, surveillance, undercover operations, and financial crime. He was also a qualified senior investigating officer for counterterrorism offenses and worked on a number of terrorist-related offenses in the northwest of England. And that expertise we're going to see come through in some of his slides. In 2005, Phil became head of the Force Professional Standards Department, responsible for investigating all criminal and misconduct and allegations against serving officers. For the last 4 years of his police service, Phil performed the role of Detective Chief Superintendent, Head of Crime for the force, with 1,300 staff, a budget of £26 million. Phil oversaw all aspects of crime investigation and policy and was a member of the Force Senior Command Team. Following his retirement in 2011, Phil established a UK private investigation company before joining Japan Tobacco International in 2013. Since that time, he has been the Anti-Illicit Trade Operations Manager for Western Europe and then additionally Central Europe. On February 6, 2017, Phil will move to Canada for 7 months on a short-term assignment where he was responsible for establishing a JDI AITO footprint across the entire Americas region. He returned to his post in September 2017 and has responsibility for 25 countries across the region, gathering information about organized crime groups involved in the illegal tobacco trade and sharing it with various law enforcement agencies. I turn the presentation over to Phil. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shelley. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. As you can see, my background is predominantly in criminal investigation. So just over 5 years ago, I knew nothing about the illegal tobacco trade, and it was touched on in that it's not a priority for police forces up and down the country in the UK and probably wider afield. But it's opened my eyes in the last 5 years, the links to serious and organised crime and the use of illegal tobacco. Dr. Shelley also touched on contraband, counterfeit and illicit whites. Just to put some meat on the bones with illicit whites, for example, they quite often appear in free trade zones. For example, in Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates, there's 26 cigarette factories who produce legally in that country cigarettes just for exportation. And they go from there into Europe, Asia and Africa. They also receive into the free trade zones many containers of illegal cigarettes. 13 million containers are handled through Jebel Ali a year. That's about 250,000 a week. But just wanted to put some context around the size of this. Countries around the world can be countries of source, where they produce illegal goods, or they can be transit countries where goods flow through them towards their destination countries. And it's primarily countries with high levels of tax which attract illegal tobacco trade. So I think also, Cathy mentioned this, the illegal tobacco trade. Why is it so attractive? In the criminal world, it's seen as low risk, high reward. The punishment if you're caught is normal, very minimal compared to smuggling drugs, for example. Serious and organised crime have existing global criminal contacts with well-established supply routes. Organised crime deal in and smuggle in commodities, cigarettes, drugs, firearms and, sadly, people. Smuggling tobacco products is a fundraiser, as also Dr. Shelley mentioned, and the opportunity to branch out into other crimes. There are many documented examples of how funds have been raised through illegal tobacco and used into terrorism. So, JDI, we have a global footprint of anti-illicit trade operations staff who are placed in each of the 5 regions that we have divided the globe into. Most of the people are ex-law enforcement or who have a vast experience within the tobacco industry. We actually employ service providers who are private investigation companies who are able to operate legally within each country. And through them, we task them or encourage them to develop and gather intelligence and evidence against individuals and groups who are involved in the illegal production, distribution and sale of tobacco products. That information then comes back to the managers, such as myself, and we develop relationships with law enforcement and are able to share that with them to enable them to fight organised crime. My role is very operationally focused, and the next 3 section of slides covers on 3 examples which highlight direct links between human trafficking and the illegal tobacco trade. The first one I'm going to talk about was from in Italy. Operation Scorpion Fish was the law enforcement name given to the investigation, and it concerned people and tobacco smuggling between Tunisia and Italy in April 2018. The investigation was coordinated by the anti-mafia team and the finance police and saw 7 Italian and Tunisian citizens arrested. They were members of a transnational organised crime group with responsibility for facilitating the illegal immigration and smuggling of illegal cigarettes. The MO had been seen before by law enforcement, as the name would suggest. They'd already done a similar investigation by the same name and had other investigations which had come to fruition. Offences were committed by the use of speedboats from the coast of Tunisia into areas of Sicily. So, having been interdicted by law enforcement in the past, why is it this crime group have put themselves on offer and have been caught under Scorpion Fish 2? And the simple answer is risk versus reward. Once the capital has been spent in respect of boats and vehicles, the ongoing revenue costs of fuel are fairly minimal. So Scorpion Fish 2 saw traffickers transport between 10 and 15 people on each trip. They were paying between 3,000 and 5,000 euros each, and at the same time they were smuggling illicit white cigarettes in the same boat as the people. There was in the region of 16,000 outers, which are cartons of 200 cigarettes, so that's 230 sticks of cigarettes. About 50,000 euros worth were also on each boat. So the organised crime groups were making large sums of money, but they did have sophisticated logistical networks to receive migrants and then store and then sell on the cigarettes. If you did the maths in respect of the sticks that were transported, it worked out about 6.4 euros per 100 sticks. You could sell one of those outers in the UK for 35 to 40 GB pounds, where the legal cost of the similar quantity is over 100 GB pounds. So countries where there's high levels of tax are that magnet to enable people to transport illegal cigarettes. That's just to put some perspective on the coastline of Tunisia and into Sicily. Once products are into Sicily, as was mentioned earlier, small boats can go up the coast into Italy itself, and then of course you're into mainland Europe. These stills were taken from the law enforcement video that was released. The one on the left, you can see a speedboat with people on it, and in the middle of that boat is the cigarettes contained in bundles. So that's a direct link between cigarette smuggling and people smuggling. I've attached in this clip 2 media articles from the Italian law enforcement and also a link to the video, which is obviously a bit more detailed and gives some more detail, but given the limited time period, I wanted just to move on and move on to the next example. I'm going to talk about the UK Modern Slavery Act. It was introduced in 2015, and the government's stated that the Modern Slavery Act will give law enforcement the tools to fight modern slavery, ensuring perpetrators can receive suitably severe punishments for these appalling crimes and enhance support and protection for victims. It received royal assent in March 2015. I've attached a link to the government website, and from there are other associated documents. So the legislation is also designed to ensure companies take responsibility for their supply chain, for the way they employ people, and it's also asking for a commitment towards countering modern slavery. So how does that work in practice? In the UK, I have a lot to do with law enforcement. I still have many contacts in organisations around the country. And UK police forces are increasingly adopting a multi-agency approach to investigations linked to raids at premises which manufacture and or sell counterfeit goods, and that can be handbags, luxury clothing, boots, hair products, and also tobacco, as well as pharmaceutical goods. These are dedicated and trained local officers who work alongside local council, social services, border force and customs officers, and they can all attend raids, and they all have a part to play in the individuals who are found at these sites. The focus of law enforcement is not just on the illegal products that are being made and sold. Yes, there's some criminality around that, but they also look at the legal status, working conditions and safety of the staff who are employed there. Illegal tobacco is very often involved in this type of activity, and indeed in the United Kingdom and Europe, it was mentioned by Cathy about the postal importations. We get packages made in the Far East that are imported into the UK by the post. Tobacco is then transported from mainland Europe into the United Kingdom, and houses or small retail units are established, and people who have been trafficked and have no papers or are being held against their will through work are then forced to work as labour in these venues. The next example I'm going to talk about was a raid which took place in the Republic of Ireland on the 15th of March this year. I was invited to attend that raid and give expert opinion on the facility and what was seized. And I'll just walk you through what the media release was. The factory was fully operational when Revenue Customs and armed officers raided it. 11 men, all from Eastern Europe, aged in their late 20s to late 50s, were arrested. And revenue officers recovered 40 tonnes of tobacco and all of the constituent parts to make cigarettes. The machinery was capable of making 250,000 cigarettes an hour. There was also living quarters attached to that site. The illicit cigarettes made there had been seen previously in the UK and Ireland, and there was 25 million sticks already made and boxed ready to go. And the revenue estimated that if they'd been sold on the streets, it would have been a loss to the country of €12 million. And the investigation carries on at a national and international level. It was a massive establishment, and everything was all under one roof. The image to the left shows just one part of the cigarette production. There are many, many million moving parts within this equipment, and the gentlemen who were arrested were Lithuanian and Bulgarians, and their expertise is keeping this old machinery running. The premises was very isolated in the middle of nowhere. These people were living on the premises, though be it they weren't chained up when the officers arrived. You could certainly infer that they may have been receiving less wages than people in a normal factory. Their health and safety and well-being certainly wasn't being maintained as it should have been. So again, that's just a direct link between people being used and exploited in the tobacco industry. JDI itself are very conscious that we have a responsibility within the legitimate supply chain. We have extensive know your customer and know your supplier networks. We have track and trace in equipment, but we are also very proud to be part of a joint initiative which was set up with the International Labour Organization, Winrock International, which is an American non-for-profit organization operating globally to empower the disadvantaged and ourselves. We work with local governments and social partners together with the tobacco growing communities, and the aim of this project is to eliminate child labour. I've also attached in the following slides some links to the site, which hopefully will enable you to gather some more information if you'd like that. So finally, in summary, organised crime groups realise that there are vast sums of money to be made from the illicit trade in tobacco products. They have existing transnational contacts and smuggling routes. They use threats and violence to achieve their objectives. And tragically, people are trafficked and exploited. Organised crime groups see them as commodities used like illegal tobacco and cigarettes to make money. That's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Phil. That was very interesting, and I'm sure the audience has questions. And please send your questions in the text chat box so that after our next speaker, there will be a discussion with our audience. Our next speaker is Kristen Reif. Kristen Reif is currently the director of Philip Morris International's Illicit Trade Prevention Group based in Washington, D.C. As part of her responsibilities, Ms. Reif oversees the development and execution of all anti-illicit trade activities, including anti-counterfeiting and anti-contraband smuggling initiatives to protect PMI's iconic brands, including Marlboro, Parliament, and L&M, among others. In her current role, Reif works closely with law enforcement, regulatory officials, and policymakers on the issue of illicit trade and its key facilitators. She regularly briefs industry and government officials on the connection between illicit tobacco trade and terrorist financing. And I want to add something that's not here. She's done a lot of work in Latin America where there is a very strong nexus with terrorist financing. Ms. Reif has nearly a decade of experience in the tobacco industry, serving in positions with Altria, Philip Morris USA, in Richmond, Virginia, as well as PMI's global headquarters in Lausanne, Switzerland. Prior to joining Philip Morris International, Ms. Reif was Vice President of the Terrance Group, a political consulting firm in Alexandria, Virginia. In her role at Terrance, Reif consulted on campaigns and elections for federal, state, and local officials across the country, including key battleground states during the 2004 U.S. presidential election. I'll turn the floor over to Kristen, and after we have our last speaker, we will come back for our group discussion. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Louise, and thanks everyone, including Babson University, for hosting this fantastic gathering of really interested folks on a very tough subject matter. I want to thanks to Cathy and Phil for really level setting with information and real life examples on the links of this. As everyone can see, it's a really critical issue. No one company, government, organization can really tackle this alone, which is why forums like this, I think, are so great. So you had Cathy with some of the statistics, you had Phil with some of the real life examples on that. What I think, fortunate enough to tell you is that I'm very optimistic about the direction of these issues, and partly because I think this is really becoming a priority for the U.S. government. What a lot of people might not know, or it might be new news to folks on this webcast, is that the U.S. State Department is currently developing a strategy for combating illicit tobacco trade internationally as part of the big comprehensive omnibus spending package that was passed in March by the administration and by Congress. The State Department was tasked, based on their previous reporting, to come up with a strategy to deal with this issue. There's a lot of milestones that have come along the way, including a congressional hearing specifically on the issue of illicit tobacco trafficking, which featured our moderator today, Dr. Shelley, whose insights were invaluable in that process. The topic merits so much attention because the annual global value of illicit trade is staggering. If you look at the slide and you add up the value of illicit trade in oil, wildlife, timber, blood diamonds, issues that have a whole of government approach, whether it's the United States government or the UK government, or groups like OECD that put significant focus on these illicit commodities, if you add them together, you're still falling just shy of what the WHO estimates is the $40 billion made by transnational criminal groups and terror organizations trafficking in illicit tobacco trade. So it should be alarming. It should merit significant attention from serious players. But the dollar value alone really isn't the story, as you've heard today. It's the convergence with other things such as public corruption, and especially human trafficking, really is what we're going to talk about. I want to go through some examples of the convergence of illicit tobacco and human trafficking, reporting on some of the connections from official government sources, as well as some case examples that I think bring it to life. Phil did a great job with that in bringing into the public space some new examples, and I'll go through that as well. In a limited amount of time that we have today, whereas I might want to go to examples all over the world, I'm going to more or less restrict my remarks to Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. As Dr. Shelley said, that was a bit of my background and experience. I have here a slide that just has a quote from Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who was testifying in front of the U.S. Senate last year in reference to Hezbollah, and he says it perfectly. He says, Hezbollah plays a central role in a new landscape where drug and human trafficking, gun running, illicit cigarette trade, trade-based money laundering, and terror finance can no longer be treated as distinct phenomena. I could not have said it better myself. There is a convergence of this, of course, globally, but I'll give examples of this government reporting and confirmation in cases from North America and the U.S.-Canadian border, all the way down to the infamous tri-border area where Paraguay and Brazil and Argentina all come together. Whereas the U.S. southern border with Mexico politically often gets the most attention these days, it's really the keen observers who understand that it's the northern border of the United States and Canada that's actually the longest, the most porous, and really provides the most opportunity for criminal exploitation. What you see on the left-hand side is a 2015 report from the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and I've copied and pasted some of the stark findings from this report, but just to save you the trouble of reading it, the summary is this. This report says that the roots are the same for terrorists, drug, and human traffickers. It talks about the reserves that straddle two different nations that pose jurisdictional challenges to law enforcement and intelligence. And many people on the webcast today know that when there are these jurisdictional challenges, when there are these gray areas, and when that kind of coordination is required, this is where criminals typically find opportunity to maneuver. They also say that the tribes are involved, or at least turning a blind eye to these issues, including, as you see there, in reference to illicit cigarette trafficking. That report was really foreshadowing because, as you see on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a map of an operation called Project Miguel, which was executed in 2016, and it was the single largest anti-illicit tobacco takedown in North American history. It was a takedown of a network that led to the arrest of more than 60 criminals. It deprived the Canadian government of nearly $500 million through this one networking operation alone, and it led to the seizure of more than just illicit tobacco, but marijuana and cocaine, methamphetamine, as well as fentanyl, which everyone knows is getting significant attention these days globally, but very specifically down the road on Capitol Hill. These routes set the stage, and there is a convergence of this with illicit trafficking of individuals, of human beings over that northern border. And the case study example here dates back to February of 2013, where there was a tobacco wholesaler named Ian Tardo who was picked up for trafficking in persons from Canada to the United States. He pled guilty as a human trafficker and doing it for, quote, purposes of commercial advantage and private financial gain. He admitted that he knew it was wrong transporting illegals from Canada and the St. Regis Village to the United States in northern New York in Messina. He did this based on an agreement that he would get $450 per person. Think about that. A human life has to be worth more than $450, but that was all he was getting for it. While he was only the driver, he was part, obviously, of a larger ring of traffickers. More than 5 were indicted in the same case. What's key about this, though, is that the involvement of somebody like Ian Tardo is because he knows the routes. He knows how to smuggle tobacco from one country to another. He knows how to easily adapt that to smuggle people into the States. It's the methodology that is the same that creates this opportunity. I've had many conversations with former law enforcement and investigators on the ground close to the case, some who know this individual personally. They indicate that this certainly was not the first time this had happened. It was just simply the first time that he got caught. If you move to the U.S. southwest border with Mexico, not surprisingly, there are similar vulnerabilities and similar opportunities for criminal organizations. Last November, the U.S. Government Accountability Office issued a report at the request of members of Congress, and their findings, you can see a quote there, but their findings identified this. They were locations and common routes, and that they were the same networks that were moving illicit goods, illicit human beings, sorry, just human beings, the movement makes it illicit, by the drug cartels. It was sworn statements by DHS ICE officials that the same transnational criminal organizations smuggling narcotics and humans are also dealing in illicit cigarettes. If you move a little further south in the Western Hemisphere to Panama, I don't know if anyone's Spanish is better than mine. I'm assuming absolutely yes on this phone call. But I put the translation of the title of this article at the bottom. It says, Asian Scammers Falsify Passports. This case in Panama is ongoing. It involves a Panamanian tobacco import-export company. This company has links with smugglers and money launderers associated with Colombian narco-terror groups like the FARC. It supplies Grupo ISA, who is a sanctioned entity by OFAC. And U.S. federal prosecutors have publicly said this company also trades with money launderers supplying the Mexican cartels. That is the Arizona State Attorneys General who has listed that in a public manner. If those things weren't bad enough, if this doesn't seem like a problem enough, the officer and legal representative of this company is also the administrator of the Passport Authority. So not long ago, the Panamanian News, as you see there, the screenshot of the article, Panamanian News published claims by a whistleblower saying that human trafficking networks are being supported by Panamanian government institutions, that they're charging $30,000 per person, and that $30,000 fee gets them a fake birth certificate, a fake Panamanian passport, and access for Chinese nationals who otherwise should not be in the country. Moving a little further south to Uruguay, there was an investigation in 2013 on a criminal target. His name was Hugo Silva Mena. This investigation produced evidence of human trafficking, cigarette smuggling, fuel smuggling, and money laundering. It was a case that it involved the collaboration of INTERPOL, as well as the local governments in Uruguay and Argentina. This investigation led to a number of raids, including the seizure of over 33,000 packs of counterfeit Marlboro. It led to the indictment of 9 different individuals with confirmation of any number of criminal activities that came out during that trial, such as the smuggling of cigarettes from Argentina to Uruguay, crossing the border unofficially by boat, that human beings were being trafficked from Argentina to Uruguay and back. Specifically, they identified the human trafficking of 4 Chinese individuals, which led to the eventual conviction of one of those in this network. So the case began in 2013, and it was finally settled in February of 2017. The court convicted this individual, Hugo Silva Mena, for human trafficking and the smuggling of cigarettes and fuel in that set of charges. Those who are familiar with the international illicit tobacco trade and the schemes and hotspots involved in those are no doubt familiar with the problem of the massive overproduction and smuggling of cigarettes out of the tri-border area of South America. But for those who are not familiar on the phone, just to quickly level set, in the country of Paraguay, legal consumption among adult consumers is approximately 3 billion cigarette sticks per year. However, the production estimated by many public sources is closer to 60 billion cigarettes per year. So there is a 57 billion delta in those numbers that ends up illegally in places like Brazil, predominantly, Argentina, and even in the past, public reporting indicated it was going to Colombia to fund the FARC. The majority of the brands found illicitly in other countries are manufactured by a company owned by the president of Paraguay. So now you have the insertion or addition of high-level public corruption in this as well. But to demonstrate that this is a truly global problem, this ties into a case of forced labor or modern-day slavery. I liked how Professor Shelley said it. It's really human exploitation of Paraguayan nationals in Europe. So in 2014, there was an illegal cigarette factory raided in Poland. In this raid, you see some of the imagery on the right-hand side of the slide. In this raid, officers seized a complete cigarette manufacturing line, 3,500 kilos of cut tobacco, 2.7 million counterfeit Marlboro, and materials to manufacture even more. At the time of the raid, 14 individuals were arrested. The interesting thing for local authorities was that 8 of them were Paraguayan. Just as Phil was talking about earlier with the Lithuanian and Bulgarian machinery know-how or savvy or expertise, however you want to say it, the same sort of scheme was occurring here. It was the ability of these criminal networks to exploit the expertise and knowledge of Paraguayan machinist technicians who certainly are familiar with the production of cigarettes and do so illicitly in a clandestine manner in Poland. If we go to the next slide here, you can see that at the time of the raid, you can understand the setup of the factory. The first floor production, there's a schematic there that shows beds only a few meters away from the machinery, from raw tobacco, from other manufacturing materials. At the very least, as Phil was talking about earlier, at the very least, these are unsanitary conditions and not amenable to human condition. The scene is played out in other venues in Poland, in Bulgaria, and the UK, and then as Phil was talking about today, in Ireland. But more than just the pictures of the living quarters and the legend of the factory floor, what I have found most compelling about this example in the intersection is really the description of the experience of the workers. I find it almost frighteningly terrifying. I have some excerpts of the interrogation, of the transcripts of the interrogation of some of these Paraguayan individuals who were picked up. And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I just want to read it to you. So the excerpt from the interrogation of Jose Maidana Sanchez. He says that in mid-May 2014 in Paraguay, he was approached by an unknown man who offered him a job in the Netherlands. Once he arrived to the Netherlands, he was picked up by a man who took him to a hotel. He sat there for a week. After a week, the man appeared again and took his laptop, mobile phone, money, and all documents away. That included his passport. He didn't know they were going to Poland. He was put in a car. They traveled for 12 hours to the location where they eventually were supposed to work. They were afraid of the other local Polish managers who were there at the factory. They were afraid to speak out. They were told not to leave. They were told not to speak Spanish. They felt as if the repercussions would be death. Another Paraguayan who was forced to work in this factory and brought there under true false pretenses to be exploited, Cesar Alvarez. In Cesar's testimony, he talks about the fact that they were afraid of these local managers, that one of them he called karateka, which I guess means karate fighter. Seems to indicate to me somebody with a violent tendency. He also describes another one of the quote-unquote managers of this illicit factory. He was nicknamed Gorilla because he was irritable. He carried a weapon. He did not have a production job. His job was to supervise, organize the food and supplies, and watch over the workers. I could go on because there are certainly more of these stories. Many of the methodologies, the typologies, though, are the same in terms of how these individuals were approached for work, how they were transported to one country in Europe. It was, for some, it was the Netherlands. For others, it was Germany. How they didn't know the final destination of where they were to go, and how they then were taken or were stripped of their money, their documents, their mobile phone, their passport. And so what I would submit to you is that once you were in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, you have no ID or passport, you have no phone, your money, you're not supposed to be there, what choice do you have left? I think you have none. You essentially at that point are a slave to someone or something else. Final example that Phil actually already covered. I just wanted to put up really quickly to say that a picture's worth 1,000 words. If you look at this example of the Operation Scorpion Fish, if you look at the example, you not only see these individuals in the boat being trafficked, you see them physically there and holding master cases of cigarettes that are later seized when the Guardia de Finanza brings them to the side. This can, I think, also fall in the category of the ant trade that Dr. Shelley talked about, because they physically are smirking these master cases of cigarettes one by one. But then the aggregation of them also seems to indicate that there is a significantly larger network. That the investigations revealed it was more than 40 million illegal sticks that were seized along with this takedown. The one other item that I would add on there is that in the reporting of this case, that there are wiretap conversations indicating the transnational criminal organization was tied to Islamic extremists who were planning out terrorist attacks in France. And I think possibly it would be wonderful to hear from Dr. Shelley later on that, who could speak more, as she's clearly written extensively on incidents in France, such as Charlie Hebdo, that did include funding of ISIS warfighters by illicit tobacco trafficking, among other sources. And finally, just to wrap it up on my last slide, what I said before, I think, still holds true. Even though this is a grim subject matter, and it's tough subject matter, this is an area of which I am actually hopeful, because I see the ball moving on this, not just with government in an official capacity, although that exists. You have the Australian Border Force standing up to the tune of $100 million, a task force on this. The UK government has had a whole of government approach for years now and have been leaders in that. And now you have the US government getting into the mix. One of the most interesting partners, if you will, in this can be considered also the US military. So what you see on the screen there is an excerpt from last year's National Defense Authorization Act. The Americans on the line will know that this is the bill that annually funds the United States military. In that legislation passed last December, you can see on the quote that trafficking worldwide encompasses a number of goods, including people, weapons, antiquities, and tobacco. The Senate Armed Services Committee is noting that with interest that some of these goods in and of themselves may not be illegal, but their illicit movement is what provides significant revenue to transnational threat networks in areas such as the Northern Triangle of Central America, the U.S.-Mexico border, as just discussed, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which we could potentially tackle on another day. So with that, I'd be happy to pass it back to Dr. Shelley, be happy to take on additional questions that we could answer here or follow up with people individually after this, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kristen, and that ends our formal presentations for the moment. I hope that you will be sending in some questions. Christina, do we have some questions that have come in yet? I'm going to start off with the first question to the three of you until we get some audience questions. But our first speaker, Cathy, talked about the role of cyber in this. But what I haven't heard much of is the role of social media in facilitating deliveries and movement, and the role that legitimate companies have played, like tech companies, which is going to be the subject of our next webinar, and what they're doing, but also sometimes how they are part of the problem, and whether there's anything in the European context similar to what we've seen in the US, where we've had the United Parcel Service, which is a major private delivery company, be fined large amounts of money, almost $250 million, because of their role in helping to smuggle cigarettes. So that's very important, and I think deserves some attention. I don't know if any of you have come across this and would like to comment some more on that.
Yeah, this is Phil. I started an online investigation about 3 years ago, and just from Facebook alone, JDI have taken down about 1.25 million UK pounds worth of JDI products from Facebook and social media. We're seeing that it's used as a gateway to facilitate illegal sales online. Obviously, sales online can be made to children, which goes against what the industry, the legitimate industry, is trying to do. There's no control over who buys these products. We've also conducted test purchases and gone up the supply chain and passed information over to law enforcement to enable them to take action. So certainly social media is a huge opportunity for individuals we see more than organised crime. There are other things on the dark net where the organised crime are using larger scale supply of products, but certainly in a very open forum, social media is being well used in the UK and across Europe.
Yeah, Dr. Shelley, I can just add to that really briefly. I think that at Philip Morris we're doing a fantastic job working with some of these online platforms, not necessarily social media as much, but the online sales platforms such as Amazon and eBay and others to ensure that, that the supply chain is being controlled, that there are not illicit sales in venues where they shouldn't be, and certainly not to people that they shouldn't. You also mentioned a bit of the UPS case, which I think is a fantastic example of some really excellent work by the New York City Prosecutor's Office, that when they were confronted with the challenge of illicit tobacco and interstate commerce and how that introduces jurisdictional issues and or stuff coming from Canada, they took a more unique approach to this, and they ensured that private industry played its proper role in controlling that supply chain, which I think is really going to be precedent-setting for other courier services. I know that it could have ramifications as those in the EU and elsewhere are looking at this problem that Cathy articulated of the high volume, low volume, high frequency distribution of illicit cigarettes.
Thank you. Cathy, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, you know, this is a priority for our research, the, you know, the online postal distance selling. From what we've done so far, you know, as has already been said, the prevalence of social media and other platforms, and that's not just for, you know, combustible illicit cigarettes, but for non-combustibles as well. Just to say that for a number of our forthcoming research projects, we will be focusing specifically on the online trade and on the permeability of the postal system, not only to illicit cigarettes, but to other forms of counterfeit. And Project Sun, the 2017 iteration that we're working on at the moment, the qualitative analysis that we'll be conducting for that, which will be released later in the year, will be focused exclusively on the online side of things.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. We have several questions from the audience. In what ways can tax policy drive consumer demand for illicit cigarette trade? What are the best practices in determining policy? Do we have anyone ready to take that one on?
So I don't know if I'm willing to take it on, but I think in terms of what is being asked here, I don't think myself nor Phil or Cathy are experts on tax policy per se, but what we can recognize is that the high taxation, high price of the product certainly creates that opportunity for criminal networks to play in that space. And I think that is part of what we're focused on, trying to make sure that those opportunities really don't exist. Again, I'm not sure if that answers the question fully, but not being a tax policy expert myself, I may need an assist on this.
Okay.
Yeah, from my perspective, in being based in the UK, there are high levels of taxation on cigarettes there, and with mainland Europe, if you even just focused on legitimate products that JDI and Philip Morris and other manufacturers make, there's vast sums of money to be made in buying those legitimate products in countries further across to the east of Europe and smuggling them further west, and that you can make more money for the same product the nearer, the further west you go. So it's clear that tax has a price to pay. I don't think it's the only one issue, and I think it was touched on in social acceptance and supply and demand, where people have got low income and they want to smoke. They can't afford legitimate cigarettes, so they will be tempted to buy illegal products, whether they be contraband or counterfeit or even illicit whites. I hope that helps.
And Dr. Shelley, I would just add to that too. I think dealing with tax policy might even be a luxury for us on the phone and those listening in. I think we're still working on trying to tackle those who don't pay any tax at all on the product. who are clearly shepherding it through illicit channels, who the WHO says are evading $40 to $50 billion worth of tax every year, which is massive.
Just to add from my perspective on, the role of tax policy and the trafficking patterns that we saw during our research for On Tap. Obviously those price differentials play a big role in dictating both the routes and the methods used. So that applies particularly where you've got two jurisdictions bordering each other where there's a very large price differential. So that may be between two EU countries or between an EU and a non-EU country. Just an example being, for example, the price of a weighted pack in Poland being €3.17 in 2016, bordering Germany where a pack is $5.47, and then much higher prices in jurisdictions further west. But where you have those differentials across one single border, that will then dictate the sort of patterns in low volume, high frequency ant smuggling that we've been talking about earlier.
I just want to add one thing. I don't think there's been enough research on what rational tax policy is that doesn't drive people into illicit markets. At what price level are people ready to pay the taxes, and at what point do they say this is too much and they begin to look for illicit alternatives? All right, we have another question. We have talked about organized crime and occasionally collaboration among countries. What is the role of international organizations like the EU and the UN in not just codifying policy and laws, but stifling efforts to illegally transport and sell illegal cigarettes? Does anyone want to start?
Yes? I was going to say, it's from Phil. My dealings at an operational level are with the organisation OLAF, who in Europe are the anti-fraud organisation. They certainly coordinate activity, law enforcement activity across different countries within Europe. I think it's fair to say that there's probably more can be done, but I think it comes back to competing demands and what governments and organisations see as a priority. And it was encouraging to hear that from Christina of what was happening in the States, and I think it's going to take something like a lead country shining the spotlight on some of the wider issues and not just focusing on tobacco. It's the links to terrorism, to people smuggling, and that sort of momentum will hopefully get some activity from broader organisations.
Phil, you talked about OLAF, but what about Europol, which is an EU organization, and how active are they in combating the illicit trade?
Yeah, I do have dealings with Europol. They do have groups. There was one initiative that was set up recently looking at what we call NTMs, which are non-tobacco materials. So it's the packaging and where they're being sourced. So they do have a part to play, and they are doing work on things like that. Obviously, we as a private industry don't get the feedback about ongoing investigations quite often until they're in the public domain, but we do support them with intelligence. And for example, the factory in Ireland and a previous one in the UK, we've tried to help in identifying where those products have come from and fed that intelligence back into law enforcement. So yes, Europol do get involved to a degree, but I think it's fair to say in mainland Europe their focus is maybe around terrorism and drugs and the movement of firearms.
Thank you. And anyone have anything to say on the role of the UN? Because illicit transnational organized crime goes under the UN Convention, and this, through all discussion, is part of transnational organized crime.
Dr. Shelley, I would just add that I think if we're if we're talking about the UN or Europol, Interpol, etc., there are many organizations that are involved in it, and I think that's the point, because this issue is so huge that there needs to be involvement and contribution from organizations like that, as well as national governments, but as well as private industry. People like Phil and myself are involved with this because the legal industry has a lot to bring to the table in terms of know-how and expertise of the legal playing field. So certainly we can assist in identifying what some of those illicit schemes or loopholes may be. So I think really it all comes back to, regardless of who is the lead agency on this, it's going to take multiple to make a dent in this issue.
If I could just add a comment, when we're talking about the role of international organizations, I think it's also important to look at this in the wider context, as Phil was saying. So looking at some of the enablers and the role of international organizations in addressing those. So thinking specifically about the role of free trade zones, for example, which has come up again and again. Phil mentioned Jebel Ali and, numerous other examples that we've come across. I think that's something that has not received enough attention, and there's really quite an urgent need to address the sort of, we haven't really got balance right, I think, between facilitating trade and ensuring security. So a movement needs to happen in the direction of establishing international standards that apply to free trade zones. And which organization leads on that is, whether it's the World Customs Organization or how that could work, sort of developing those kind of integrity standards that apply across the board, I think is something that's really important.
And anybody have anything to say on the World Health Organization? We have a question on the World Health Organization as well, and what more they could be doing or what impact they are going to be having. All right.
Yeah, sorry. From an operational perspective, I certainly don't have a great deal to do with the World Health Organization. I know that obviously parts of our organization do, but apologies, that's not my area of expertise.
Okay. There's also another question that I think should fall into this group's areas of expertise. Are there any initiatives underway with JDI or other cigarette companies to employ blockchain technology to enhance transparency on anti-trafficking or smuggling in their supply chains?
Yes, sure. We have an extensive track and trace network, as do the other tobacco manufacturers, and in fact we're being legislated to make sure that gets introduced so that we can track and be held responsible for goods that we supply to our first line suppliers and further on down that chain. And with the products being marked, we're then able to conduct investigations when they're seized in the wrong marketplaces, and we will take action against our customers who have wrongly supplied quantities, and we have in fact stopped supplying products to companies who have breached rules that we've set with them within contractual basis.
And I can add just a very similar sentiment to what Phil just said here about what PMI does. In terms of this issue, controlling our own supply chain is first and foremost the priority of this organization. We have taken measures, just as Phil was describing, in terms of being able to track and trace our own product and understand the marketplace where volumes are in line with what consumption would be, to make sure that distributors and others are not oversupplying the market or individual retailers, and then taking appropriate action if and when we see that is happening. And so I believe that is It is a gold standard and a hallmark of the legal industry and the players who are doing it right, and it should be a challenge to others in this industry who are not doing it yet to please get on board.
I think there are many people raising the hope that blockchain can be a cure, and I think it's something that's worth watching, of how much technology can be a help in this area in monitoring codes and barcodes and seeing if things are not corresponding, and this should be able to help distributors as well to make sure that illicit trade is not coming in ways that deceive them, because there's very high levels of deception. I mean, some of the cases that you showed pictures of are factories that look quite primitive, but some of these that are coming out of Paraguay and elsewhere are much more, or free trade zones are much more sophisticated than those that have been caught. And their possibility of engaging in illicit coding is important in propagating their product. Okay, there's a question for Kristen. In the 2017 NDAA, which was the first time that the U.S. military was authorized to counter transnational organized crime, how do you think militaries can best be employed in the fight against these groups and activities?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, no, it was a historic event, and it was really encouraging to see the U.S. government in many levels taking action on this past year. In terms of how I believe the U.S. military can be deployed in this fight, first and foremost, over the next 6 months, they are reporting on this issue with what they see on the ground, and specifically in those hotspots of the Northern Triangle of the U.S.-Mexico border, and specifically Afghanistan, Pakistan. I believe understanding and making an assessment of the level of the problem, the severity of the problem, and some of those involved will lead to an action that may be law enforcement or maybe otherwise. Specifically, it was encouraging to see Afghanistan-Pakistan border be identified there. I've heard now multiple people mention free trade zone issues, and the product that is illicit and rampant on that Afghanistan-Pakistan border can be tracked right back to the Jebel Ali free zone. And so there is so much that could be done in terms of policy and closing loopholes to really ensure that product does not get to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border where it funds the Taliban. That those organizations moving those cigarettes have to pay the Taliban a tax or a tribute, because to get anything through, to get toilet paper or diapers through, you have to pay the Taliban, so certainly to move illicit cigarettes. So that should be incredibly alarming, but then also provide an opportunity to track the problem back to where there is really more of an epicenter of this manufacturing, transshipment, and then diversion into conflict zones.
There's a further question that was asked of me, but also of you, of what are these crime terror connections that you're seeing? Could you talk a little bit more about this fascinating case of smuggling from North Africa into Italy, which seemed to have some terrorist connections? Is there more that you know than you discussed? And is there anything more that you can say on the role of ISIS in cigarette smuggling?
So sure, I can start, and then maybe I pass it back to you to help fill in some of the blanks, because you are truly an expert on this. As it relates to the Operation Scorpion Fish, excuse me, in terms of that, I have what everyone else has in the public reporting. We are looking into it. We certainly have human resources deployed, whether it's PMI employees or service providers who are on the ground in the EU as well as in Italy. So I hope to have more information on that, but certainly the reporting so far from the ground makes it sound like a lot of nefarious actors converging on there, not the least of which are those who could be planning some sort of event or attack in France as it relates to ISIS, and I referenced before some of your own work, Dr. Shelley, on this, which was fantastic. What we've also seen is that as the battle was raging on several years ago, or up till just recently, we did see through their own documents, given that ISIS is and was an incredibly bureaucratic organization and kept incredible records and ledgers and track of all kinds of transactions. They even used PowerPoint slides, which to you, corporate America, know that warms our hearts to see PowerPoint slides. And on those confiscated documents, there are images, and we have those, and I'm happy to share them with anyone who wants to contact me directly. There are images of the money that was made by ISIS, by province, and by commodity. And so you can see on there what they were making, or what they were at least reporting, that they were bringing in via oil, what they were bringing in via confiscations, and specifically confiscations of cigarettes. So they would make money from cigarettes in a variety of ways. One is the confiscation of them, and then the punishment of the smuggler. It was from the taxing of the smuggler for safe passage through ISIS-held territory, as well as taxing or fining of the individual smoker. So they certainly went after the revenue stream of cigarettes on multiple levels within that held territory. But maybe you have some comments to add in terms of the Charlie Hebdo example or others.
I was just going to say that this example that you're using about ISIS and its territory was, even though ISIS under its ideology should not be using cigarettes, this was as a funding source, and it helped fund terrorist attacks in France, but it was also a way of generating significant revenues in ISIS-occupied territories, and I think you've done a good summation of that. And I talk a little bit about that in my next book. But I think it's very important to be thinking about these convergences and how, when we're finding them, they are not in just one locale, but patterns that are repeated elsewhere. There's a question to me and others: to what extent is the illicit cigarette industry linked to other organized crime and illicit trade, including narcotics, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking? And is the illicit cigarette trade linked to terrorism? We've just covered that. I mean, we've identified cases that we can see of linkages to terrorism in South America, funding from North America, going on between Africa and Europe, and it's also a problem in the Middle East. But what we're seeing is, as was mentioned, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, that I think Cathy was talking about, was the convergence with counterfeits. And that's a major illicit business. And maybe some of you could say a little bit more about how the cigarette trade converges with other types of counterfeit products.
Sure, yes. Thank you, Dr. Shelley. Yeah, certainly keep things on my own doorstep. The northwest of England is a real hotbed of counterfeiting goods. There's an area of Manchester which law enforcement has tried for many years to tackle. And if you walk the streets of the Cheetham Hill area in Manchester, there is many counterfeit goods for sale, handbags, electrical goods, the full range of sports equipment. It's really cheap, it's poor quality. We can surmise the conditions that the goods were made under, and in those same premises and in those same streets is the access to illegal tobacco. The crime groups that run these organisations are quite happy to, interestingly enough, to put aside historical, religious or geographical conflicts that they've had with other nations, and are prepared to work together in a multinational country towards the aim of making money from the counterfeit industry. And not only, as we've talked about, in respect of the harm that it does on communities. Certainly in respect of cigarettes, I've done some work both in the UK and offered some advice in Canada around the risk of illegal cigarettes when it comes to fatal house fires. The paper that's used in the genuine product is designed to go out if left unattended, whereas illicit whites and counterfeit goods use cheap paper, and they have been held accountable, illegal cigarettes, for a number of fatal house fires, both in the UK and in Canada. So it's the broader risk that is posed to the communities and individuals by counterfeit goods. We know that also in the Northwest we see regularly media coverage from law enforcement who have seized a number of counterfeit items, clothing, handbags, shoes, cigarettes and cocaine. So there is a direct link into narcotics and the illegal use of drugs. So it's a whole plethora around counterfeit goods, which we as an industry across all of the manufacturers are keen to try and support law enforcement to take action, because we can see the broader risks to communities, not only the closure of genuine retailers, but to the health and safety of people who use counterfeit goods.
Thank you. Any more comments on this?
I'd just add that, yeah, I mentioned this earlier, but this was one of the most common crossovers we came across in our research was the crossover with other forms of counterfeit, and Phil's just mentioned a lot of them. So yeah, could give examples, but I think of relevance here is, as you've already mentioned, is the role of common factors in enabling those crossovers. So the role of corruption in creating those pathways which can be exploited by for the movement not only of illicit cigarettes but of counterfeit clothing, counterfeit electrical goods, and similarly ability to exploit the postal system. So I think focusing on the enablers and those vulnerabilities in the system is a useful way to look at the those convergence issues as a whole.
Do you have anything to add, Kristen?
Sure, yeah. If I could just add to that, what I would say is I agree with what has been said so far. And then what I would add is that there are initiatives that private industry has taken, even though we often, folks like Phil and myself, are often talking about illicit whites and the smuggling of goods. What remains with this counterfeit issue is really an opportunity for us to then partner with other brand owners and other industries on this to fight these networks, because we cannot just remain siloed into what we are looking at, but it is the networks who, as you would say, use venture capital or diversify their operations, and they will trade in any one of these items. And so in that spirit, our organization has worked in markets all over the world, and just a couple of quick examples. One in Costa Rica over the past couple of years, where we worked with those in the alcohol industry, pharmaceutical industry, personal consumer goods industry to launch a smartphone application called Mercado Ilegal that had an ability to empower local consumers, local citizens, to identify where they saw counterfeits being sold in the open market. It was something that was utilized by law enforcement. It was the contribution of many industries in the AmCham. It was endorsed by U.S. officials who were focused on security in the Northern Triangle area at the time. So that initiative was from several years ago, as well as I mentioned that just a couple weeks ago at the IPR Center, when they were celebrating their 10-year anniversary, the Intellectual Property Center, sorry not to use jargon, Intellectual Property Rights Center here in the U.S., it brought together brand owners such as ourselves and others, and actually signed a declaration of intent against counterfeiting with maritime shipping lines. So I think that there are opportunities like that of collaborations on that issue of counterfeit by brand owners and in collaboration with official government entities such as the U.S. IPR Center that could potentially help us to combine this information shared knowledge, and go after whether it's smuggling or the counterfeiters themselves.
Thank you. And before you get off the line, Kristen, the last question that we have is for you. Will PMI continue funding the program it started 2 years ago to provide funding for technical assistance to customs and other law enforcement agencies in Europe in order to strengthen their technical and administrative capacity to fight smuggling of cigarettes, tobacco, and cheap whites? If so, what budget will be made available for that? Thank you.
So, in terms of this question, I'm happy to say that we are incredibly proud of what we have done so far in order to enable, not just in Europe, but globally, law enforcement in terms of training, technical capacity, equipment, etc. I'm not certain the exact program that the questioner is referring to, but I can say
PMI impact.
Okay, fantastic. I was going to say then, if that is the case, we are talking about PMI impact. For those who are tuned in, and this is a new opportunity for you all. PMI impact was an initiative that was launched 2 years ago where we pledged $100 million to fight against illicit tobacco trade, and that is money that was available via a grant program with expert council, individual and independent members who are going through the list of projects and deciding on those that would be most helpful in fighting illicit trade in local markets. We have gone through 2 rounds of that pledge, and there is 1 additional round still to go. So for this time, I can assure everyone that we are living up to our commitment that we have made on that. What happens next, it may be above my pay grade in order to make that determination, but certainly what I can say is that we have been committed so far. The first round of funding has been distributed. We are hoping to see those results realized and those projects really become operational, because we believe that is a key part of this. Just to go back to the idea that it's just not one company or one initiative, it's not one industry, not one government, but this is a bit of our contribution to the larger picture in a truly all boats rise mentality.
Great. Thank you. And it's wonderful that a corporation is funding research and practical efforts. We now have time for a few minutes for concluding remarks. So please limit yourself to 2 or 3 minutes maximum, and then I'll hand the floor over to Christina. Thank you. So Cathy, would you start?
Sure. I think the thing that springs to my mind is, just how much of this discussion from all of the speakers has focused on these overlaps, between different crime types, whether that's, we've talked a lot about the human trafficking link, also to, other forms of counterfeit, to drugs, to terrorism. And I think, awareness of this convergence issue, the use of, venture capital to fund other crime types, it's something that, I go back to what I said before about social acceptability. The perception that, it's fine to buy illicit cigarettes because it's just, it's just illicit cigarettes. That it's a victimless crime. And, if we can tackle this sort of widespread social acceptability, we can really take the profit out of this. And of course, levels of social acceptability vary depending on location and other factors. But I do think there's a lot of work to be done on really on driving this sort of public awareness of all of the issues we've been talking about today. So thanks very much to the other speakers for great presentations. It's been very interesting. Thanks.
Okay, on to Phil. Thank you.
Hi, I think Cathy's just really summarised the debate, really. We've covered a wide range of issues. We've identified serious and organised crime sits behind the illegal tobacco trade and other forms of organised crime, from terrorism to drugs to people smuggling, I don't think the general public are alive to those sorts of threats that exist within their communities. On the broader global picture, we've talked about free trade zones. The legislation currently exists that if tobacco leaves Jebel Ali and the paperwork says tobacco and it passes through a country such as Malta or Italy, then there's nothing anyone can do about that if they're goods in transit and they are illegal whites. If they're counterfeit, something can be done. So there's legislation that can be looked at to try and help solve the problem. It's the people who are making money from subjecting people to misery in respect of exploitation and trafficking, and the graphic examples that were given before of the people who were taken to Poland, and that is mirrored around the world. We need to highlight those human elements of that are the consequences of the actions of the criminals who are making money, and that way we might enable us to make some change in the views of the public who are the actual consumers.
Kristen?
So I just think just in conclusion of this, I thank the other presenters for all of their information and examples, and some of them I might shamelessly steal in the future, so be on the lookout for that. There are actual solutions to this problem. I think a lot of times when you have forums, you have a lot of issue raising, and specifically because, as Phil just said, there's not a great level of awareness among the general population, and that's something we can absolutely work on. I would be happy to participate in another one of these where we can talk about just solutions to the problem for the entire time, because there are so many. There are solutions that include comprehensive, coordinated strategies that have appropriate levels of funding for law enforcement. We can talk about increasing penalties, about making sure that there is destruction of seized goods. So why is there machinery showing up in Poland that should have been destroyed in Brazil or Paraguay when it was found illicitly there? Why do we not have better control of the supply chain? And by that I'm talking about the key inputs to manufacture. Why, when I go to CVS when I have a stuffy nose to go get a Sudafed, it's non-prescription, yet I have to show my ID. We have that under lock and key, yet we are allowing the means of production and mass overproduction of criminal networks on the open market. To the free trade zone example as well that has been referenced by both Cathy and Phil, the idea that we need common sense policies to monitor and regulate what's going on there. And by common sense, this is just due diligence of the operators that are receiving the benefit of operating within that zone. This is about them knowing their customer and making sure that the customer is legitimate, buying legitimate volumes. And it's about identification of a final market of destination. These things are not business inhibiting. These things are common sense, and they are policy solutions that I think we can all agree are long overdue, and looking forward to working on those. So thank you for kickstarting the conversation with this forum, and I would be happy to follow up with others, answer questions, or be a part of any group that's going to be working towards solutions to this problem.
There's one comment I want to make in the last minute, which is that there's so much money behind this activity and people profiting from it, but it is not all just criminal organizations. There are a lot of powerful politicians and their families and high-level corrupt officials in customs and elsewhere that make this trade possible. And therefore, we need to be thinking about this with a much broader conception of what organized crime is, and not just traditional criminals, but individuals who fit the UN definition of transnational crime, but are not necessarily the thugs that are threatening the guys on the shop floor in Poland. They are much more powerful and malicious actors than that. Thank you. Now, Christina, if you'll announce the next event. And I want to thank all our speakers who were so interesting and engaging. So it was great being with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you, Dr. Shelley, for moderating. Thank you to Cathy, Phil, and Kristen for such a dynamic conversation. I know that we're going to be talking about this webinar for a while with all of the different case studies and information presented. I'm already receiving emails about how much the participants have enjoyed the webinar, and I just want to thank all of you for your time and efforts in making this possible and for the work that you do each and every day. I want to thank our technical administrators, John Florendo and Teddy, for broadcasting here from Babson. We're so excited to be bringing this webinar series to all of you. And I want to announce the next webinar, which is going to be on Thursday, June 14th, from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 to 6 p.m. Central European Time. It's going to be on cybercrime and human trafficking. It's our final webinar for our 2018 series on these different intersections of transnational organized crime and human trafficking. We're going to be covering a range of topics, including the role of the banking industry. We're going to be covering the Super Bowl and sporting events, and artificial intelligence. So you'll have to tune in to find out more. And you can register and find all of the recordings for the Respect webinars on the Respect website at www.respect.international. So I want to thank all of you again for your participation and sticking with us for the 2 hours. And I wish you a great rest of the day and evening and afternoon. And I look forward to having you participate in June. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.